Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Comenzamos la reunión.
Let's kick off the committee meeting, colleagues. First of all, we need to adopt the draft agenda. There aren't very many members here, unfortunately, but I did want to say that items 5 and 6 on the agenda on long-term plan for cod stocks are being shifted to tomorrow, the 19th. Mrs. Dodds can't be with us. So they'll be replaced by 17, Mr. Romeva's report on preventing and deterring and eliminating IUU fishing. We've got in touch with Mr. Romeva. He doesn't mind, and that's what we would propose if no one objects. Now, in a previous meeting, I said, I'm going to say it again, but this is the last time, unless we have really important reasons, that we change the agenda. Because what tends to happen, if something doesn't suit someone, they try to get the agenda changed at the last minute. I've mentioned this to the coordinators before. It's good for the person who wants to change things, but it's bad for the committee, the services and colleagues who might be here because some particular point was of interest to them. It gets changed at the last minute and everyone's timetabling is turned upside down. It's a pity there aren't more members here, but I want to say this very clearly. I don't want to see any changes in the agenda in the future unless there are really exceptional circumstances. Another thing is that before the agenda is published, the Secretariat, who is ultimately in charge, will get in touch with everyone to see if there are any problems. But the first point on the agenda always seems to be changing the agenda, changing this and changing that and seeing if you agree. I don't want to do that anymore, and so I want that to become the exception. At the moment, it's the rule. So we'll change that. I think that it'll mean we'll treat the committee a bit more seriously. I think that most members are members of only one committee, or full members of one committee, and they should basically spend the full 2 days of the meeting here, not just when some point that they're interested in happens to be on the agenda. Anyway, can we adopt a change in the agenda? We can. Item 2, the minutes of the meeting of the 21st and 22nd. Well, in fact, they haven't been translated yet, those minutes, so we'll leave that in abeyance and we'll approve those minutes when we meet in our meeting in March. Chairman's announcements now. Let me point out something that you'll be already aware of, but it's worth bearing in mind, I think. In a previous coordinators meeting it was, we had a proposal for a motion for a resolution on the CITES COP meeting. It was approved in the previous meeting, as to say. And of course it has some elements in it which I think ran counter to positions that we'd adopted in this committee. That's why we asked for the Environment Commissioner to come here, and we had an oral question in plenary to that effect. I'm just mentioning this for information. And if you like, we can take this further, or just note the matter and move on. And another point. Tomorrow morning, item 9, the exchange of views with Commissioner Damanaki. We have to ask whether we do it in camera or not, but the decision ultimately has been that we do it in camera so that we can discuss any issue which we feel like raising with the Commissioner. Any questions on the announcements? No. Okay, the European Maritime... yes, Mrs. Fryer, there is a question. On CITES, Mr. Chairman. In fact, they approved something we've always been against, chartering and certification. The Environment Committee did this. And I would like environment, when it comes to CITES, where a lot of fisheries-related things come up, should try and work with us a bit on these fisheries-related matters. Envy came up with a proposal where they talked about making chartering and certification more flexible. And everyone, or almost everyone in Envy, voted in favour. It would be a good thing for them. They know a fair bit about fisheries, but they should try and get and liaise with us when they're discussing things like this. Every year, when we're talking about CITES, they cooperate with us and coordinate with us, because we are saying to the commissioners, this can't happen, we don't want that, and then another committee votes something totally against our line without bothering to talk about us, because I think this particular issue is something that they don't even think it's all about in Envy. Otherwise, they wouldn't have supported it. They're not, basically, they're coming out in favour of RUU fishing here. That's what makes me think they're completely ignorant of the paragraph concerned in the document. So I think we should be very careful on topics like this, and particular CITES-related issues, which is an area where Envy never gets together with us and never tries to agree a particular line, and this is an area where it's extremely important. Thank you, Mrs. Fraga, says the Chairman. Well, we can proceed along those lines. The Secretariat can get in touch with the Envy Secretariat and look at this a bit more closely, and I'll speak with the Chairman of Envy and say that we need to have a closer relationship on issues which are within the purview of both committees. Obviously, each committee is ultimately independent. It takes its final decisions. Mr. Davis.
Just to say, Chairman, I think we have, as Julie Girling walks in, I think we have two of the Environment Committee coordinators here, and we are not adverse, I suspect, to cooperation with the PESH Committee. It would be against our interests to be so. So, by all means, let us facilitate communication.
De acuerdo. Estamos todos en...
Okay, everyone seems to be in agreement, more or less, there. Anything else, colleagues? Okay, let's move to item 4. The European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, repeal of Council Regulations 1198-2006, 1181-2006. Mr. Cadec is our rapporteur. The deadline for tabling amendments expired on the 10th of January. 2,445 amendments have been tabled. Budgets, Employment and Envy have also tabled their own amendments, and what we're going to do today is look at these amendments. And so I'll give the floor to Mr. Cadec, our rapporteur, and then to any colleagues who want to speak. Mr. Cadec.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Well, as you have said, more than 2,445 amendments, to be exact, and 400 amendments from various other committees for opinion. So I'd like to thank everybody for all of the work that they have done on this very large piece of work. That means that the rapporteur and the shadows have a lot of work to do as well, and all of you. So I'd like to say thank you, because it proves that everybody is very concerned about this dossier, but I've never doubted as much. The first comment I'd like to make is that the discussion on the European Maritime Fisheries Fund in future, the MFF, will take place after the vote on the basic regulation. So in the context of the basic regulation, that we adopted during the last plenary. I didn't vote personally, but which was adopted at the last plenary in Strasbourg. Now, I wanted to say how satisfied I was to see that the principle of transferable fishing concessions was not taken on board. It was not opened up in plenary, and also the landing obligation was also adopted. You know what my position is on that particular area. The majority of members of Parliament called for this obligation to land catches, and of course we need to include that, therefore, into our considerations on the EMFF. So we've already had a first Shadows meeting to work out our working methods that we're going to use. We agreed on a certain number of principles which will allow us to work, I hope, in the best possible conditions in order to obtain the best possible compromises. But once again, it's not just the shadow rapporteurs who are active. All of the other members, of course, are welcome to discuss the various points or the various amendments. I think it's important that everybody can give their point of view. Now, when it comes to financing and the draft on the EMFF, which I drew up after the Commission's tabling of their document, I wanted to invest in two particular priorities. The first was, of course, sustainability. I think we all agree on that idea in the broadest sense of the term. We all agree, I think, that we want there to be sustainability in European fisheries on all levels, in all areas, environmental, economic, social, and also competitiveness. So the first point is sustainability. Now, in the document, I emphasize that we need investment in selectivity of fishing gear. Now, I say that this is to do with the landing commitment upstream, as it were. It stops the need for discards. If you catch less by using selective fishing gear, then there's less of a need for discards, and that complies with the discard ban. It seems logical. Secondly, now facilitating the implementation of management plans, that would seem necessary to me too. I think we all agree on that too. There's no major opposition to that either. Now, I want the European Union to also support temporary bans or temporary stoppages. There's another important point to do with the sustainability of European fisheries as well, which I think we need to be clear on. I'm completely against any investment which would increase the capacity of fishing fleets. I think that European capacity, even if it's not well defined at the moment, you all know what I think in the major lines anyway, we know that it really shouldn't be increased. I'd also like us to make the payments to do with the EMFF conditional on respecting the capacity ceilings that are going to be set per member state. I think that when we discuss this with the shadow rapporteurs and with you, dear colleagues, I think that there needs to be a condition attached, an ex-ante condition, as the Regional Development Committee suggested and have put in place for other European funds. Also, this is an important point, and I think you share this as well. I think verification is important, as is data collection, checks, monitoring. That's what I want to say on sustainability. Moving on to competitiveness now in European fisheries. I'm against the idea that this financial instrument be a reconversion tool, as it were, for, in the etymological sense of the word, for fishermen. It should be a tool for diversification, complementing other fisheries activities. But the word diversification, I think, is a bit radical and perhaps could give rise to anxiety because people might be thinking that we're turning fishermen into something other than fishermen, and that's not the idea of the proposal that I'm making. However, once again, diversification might be interesting if you look at it in hand with the word complementarity. I think we need to help young people, young fishermen, get involved in the profession. It's a good profession, even if it's a hard one. And we need to invest in vocational training, therefore. That would seem necessary to me. The last point, which is one perhaps that might be cause for a bit of friction, we'll see, we've certainly seen it in some amendments, is European Union investment in modernisation of the European fishing fleet, which, let me remind you, for those who perhaps not have heard this in the last 3.5 or 4 years, is around about 27 or 28 years old on average. Also, let me repeat, with the words of caution that I have mentioned before, namely, I want to see a renewal of the fishing fleet because it's getting older. But once again, let me repeat, without increasing this fleet's capacity. This is something I've said a number of times before, a slogan that I'm going to repeat now. As I said, if there's no fish, there are no fishermen, so they've got to preserve the source. But we should fish better rather than fishing more. So that really is the philosophy behind the document that I have tabled. You've worked very well with your 2,445 amendments, and what I can say is that I will do everything I possibly can as the rapporteur with my colleagues, the shadow rapporteurs, to get the best possible number of compromises which will allow everybody to support the text. It's not always easy to do this kind of thing. We saw that with the basic regulation as well. But I think that there are a large number of points where we need to find agreements, where we need to find common ground. Because I think all of us here, well, at least I hope this is the case, we're all motivated by the question of the survival of European fisheries. That's certainly what I hope is the case. Now, of course, we need a certain amount of management. We saw that on the basic vote, a certain amount of room for manoeuvre and compromise. But I think we're all on the same line here. So, Chairman, I'm sure we're not going to be able to take all of the amendments which we have in front of us, but I'm very eager to hear your points of view. And we'll be working once again with the shadows. We're going to start the day after tomorrow. That's the first meeting with the shadow rapporteurs. Day after tomorrow, we're going to be working on the 3 first blocks. And there are already compromise proposals, and I hope we're going to be able to make quick progress, even if it's only on those first points. So there we are. I'm all ears, and once again, I'm at your service as the rapporteur. The rapporteur's there to serve the Parliament and his colleagues, and nothing else. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cadec.
Bien, tenemos 12 peticiones.
I've got 12 colleagues down on the speakers list. Oh, someone else. 13. 14. Obviously, we need to fit these people into the time available. So, I think we're okay this afternoon, since we've got rid of 2 agenda items. So we'll try to get everybody in, but please stick to 2-3 minutes, colleagues, no more, if you can. Otherwise, we won't have enough time to finish the other items on the agenda. Mr. Wałęsa is first up.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen,
As for my amendments, I'd like to focus on those which pertain to the actual draft regulation per se, rather than the recitals. I'd like to focus specifically on 3 amendments, which I consider to be the most important. The first one is Amendment 484 to Article 3, Para 2, Item 6. It is extremely important with respect to inland fisheries. The proposal extends the definition of the fisherman in such a way that a member state may have greater influence on how this is going to be defined, given the diverse specificity of this sector. In item 6 of the definition of farmer, as it stands today, only covers maritime fisheries. It does not take into account the specificity of aquaculture or inland fisheries, nor does it take into account under-ice fishing, where operators don't use vessels, nor do they collect living things of the sea. This is not understandable, nor is it in line with the actual general trend of the development of the fisheries, i.e. the reinforcement of aquaculture and inland fisheries as an alternative to restrictions in other types of sea fisheries. The current wording does not include the the vessel owner or the managers of inland waters who manage waters on behalf of the state treasury, or the co-owner of a fish farm, or the workers in the fish farm who actually work in aquaculture per se. Therefore, I hope that my Amendment 484 will be supported. The second amendment is Amendment 705 to Article 7, Para 2. Shared management will guarantee the minimum of funds which will be allocated to all the member states and will be served to implementing the integrated fisheries policy. We should promote actions that will affect the largest possible access of beneficiaries to the Fisheries and Maritime Fund, which is only possible in the event when these funds are co-managed, shared management. Only then can you actually expand the list of beneficiaries who have enough experience and know-how to carry out their tasks. The actual divisions of what the kind of elements of integrated fisheries policy may be implemented as per the direct and or shared management principles, this could be defined when member states agreed together with the European Commission. And the last amendment is 868 and 869 to the relevant article. What is important here is the criterion of historical allocation and the actual take-up of funds, which on the one hand would allow for continuity in the implementation of the common fisheries policy in all member states across several programming periods. And on the other hand, it would make it possible for us to appreciate the actual efficiency in funds spending. The allocation criteria should also have a reference to inland fisheries, especially to the capacity of aquaculture. It would confirm that in the face of current fishing restrictions, aquaculture is an alternative when it comes to fish products. Thank you.
Gracias, señor Wałęsa.
Dziękuję panu Wałęsie. Kolejny mówca. Chris, proszę bardzo. Panie Przewodniczący.
I would like to speak, but if he could go first for us.
Pues damos la palabra al señor Torvalds.
Okay, some confusion. I think I prepared a slightly longer statement, but due to what the chairman wished to keep us short, I think I have to skip part of my points here. But first of all, I think we have a good proposal from the Commission, and what we have so far spoken with Mr. Cadec, I think we have some perspective of getting a good report from the Fisheries Committee. But first, the first point is actually the basic regulation. I think the MFF should be sort of in tandem with the basic regulation and with the MSY levels. And so we have to find out different solutions for those, and I think Alain already spoke about that. Second, new building and scrapping. I think we have considerable problems in this area, and those problems are, some of them are very, to put it slightly there, very interesting. Alain already said that the average fleet age is something like 25, 20, or 30, 27, 28. I know that Finnish boats, trawlers, are much older. And we are actually caught in a very interesting dilemma. Finnish trawlers have by tradition been family-owned. But now they are made into companies, and those companies are bought by Estonian fleets, and they are now sailing under Finnish flag. And we think, we don't know, but we think that it's actually spilling over of EU money, making the Estonian companies able to buy resources in Finnish waters. So again, we don't see how EU money actually works in this during those circumstances. So I think we have to look through it. We are not going to allow taxpayers' money to go into catching more fish. And we have, together with Chris and with Mr. Lyon, tabled some amendments about this. We have a problem, I think that's common. Even we spoke already about old fishing vessels, but we should also speak about old fishermen. Because what we see in all regions, and I think it goes for all the Nordic countries, and I saw Mr. Wałęsa was nodding, it goes probably for Poland also, we have an immensely old fishermen club out there on the seas. If you look at where they are in the age rostrum, we have a majority which is over 50 years old and becoming 60, and some of them will be good pensioners out on the seas, and that's not how we would like to have it. So we have to find ways to get younger people interested in fishing, and to invent that way is not going to be very easy when we at the same time have to restrict overfishing. So there's a lot of articles about agriculture, aquaculture. We have to look into this business, and we have lots of amendments in this direction. And then the fifth point, sanctions and IUU fishing. In principle, the principle of conditionality is very important. A policy is only as strong as its implementation. And we have seen over the years that implementation hasn't always been what it should be. They don't fulfill data collection, and there is a need to tackle the problems of IUU fishing within the member states' waters. Just to save some time, I think I shall stop here. Thank you, Mr. President, and then we go on.
Bien, gracias.
Thank you. Mr. Davies, would you like to take the floor?
No he dado, vamos a ver, voy a aclarar una cosa.
Let's just be clear about things. I can give you the floor here. in this first debate to the shadows, because we've gone past the shadows. We're looking at the amendments, so all the MEPs are tabling their amendments. That's why I haven't given the floor to the shadows as we did last time. At the first exchange of opinions, we gave the floor to the shadows, talking about amendments. All MEPs have amendments, so I've given you the floor in the order that people have asked.
Thank you. Well, first, a question really to you and the Secretariat about those amendments which deal with matters which are touched upon in the basic regulation. For example, TFCs. There were some proposals amongst the amendments calling for financial help for TFCs, but the Parliament has now decided that we shouldn't have TFCs. So will those amendments fall, or do we vote for things that only a few weeks ago we denied? Could you give us some interpretation? Now, as for the approach I'm taking, I suspect is going to be common to many of us, and indeed I've listened to the rapporteur, and I think there's a lot more common ground than there was perhaps a few months ago. Like he, I want to see good science and data collection, and I believe we should have financial support for that. I want to see enforcement of the rules, financial support for that. I want to see methods to ensure that the discard ban can be implemented properly through the subsidy for selective gear, for better storage facilities at ports, for better marketing of fish, which otherwise I remember Stuart Stevenson saying, there could be fish rotting on the decks. But, none of us want that. We want to be able to put the fish to the most effective use we can. The issue of management plans was also raised by the rapporteur. We want to make sure that stakeholders are involved in the preparation of management plans, and there may be some financial oil that needs to be dripped to make those wheels turn. And then what about the RACs too? I wouldn't like the RACs not to be able to say, yes, we want to be able to, for example, to commission our own scientific study, an independent study, free of industry or NGO bias. Where would the money come from that? It seems to me the MFF is one of those places. A couple of points of disagreement. Well, Mr. Cadec calls, of course, for. I'm glad to hear what he says about not increasing capacity, but the renewal of the fishing fleet always strikes fear in my heart, because so much money has been misused, I think, in the past, when we were providing for the modernisation of the fishing fleet. Okay, now we're just talking about engine replacement, by and large, but it's difficult to imagine how engine replacement does not actually increase the capacity of fishing boats. And then finally, the matter of diversification. Now, I know the rapporteur is rather against this because there's only so much money. But we have a lot of small coastal communities. We have a lot of. There are inevitably changes in the industry. We look to supporting coastal communities and fishermen who no longer have an opportunity because the industry has changed. And I'm not opposed to the idea that money should go towards diversification of one kind or another. Although I recognise that the overall budget we have for a 7-year period is not huge. So it has to be used well. Finally, very finally, small scale. We haven't really mentioned small scale. I don't know how we support it, but where we are going for money, we should try and make sure that we recognise that 80% of the jobs are in the small scale fishing fleet. And the money should not go purely to the 20% who should, if we put in place the right fishing reforms, have a profitable and successful business future.
Gracias, señor Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Now, thinking of the question that you've just asked, the best person to ask that would be the rapporteur, but I want to make sure that things are compatible in terms of approval of what should be approved and what we're going to talk about, given that we're at this initial phase at the moment, looking at amendments, trilogues, approval. So during that long track, there may be many matters arising which aren't necessarily that much in line or might be in line, but at the moment it's quite valid. There shouldn't be major problems unless anyone disagrees, perhaps. Rapporteur, Secretariat. Is that okay? Mr. Romeva.
Merci en tout cas, Alain. Merci pour le travail évidemment.
Well, thank you very much, Alain. You've done a great deal of work, as we have done as well. And there are two documents for us to follow. Firstly, the one that we adopted in Strasbourg, but also the positions that were adopted by the ministers in Council last October. So there's quite a lot of information we need to go through if we want to know what the governments wanted back then and what we want now, vis-à-vis the Rodust report, which we have just adopted. So the question for me is quite clear. You said it quite well, and I agree to the principles. We can't accept a financial logic that would increase capacity. We all agree that. But the devil's in the detail, as it were, in the subtitle. How are we going to achieve that? And Mr. Davis said this as well, and I agree with him. If you look at the history of European financing, you can see the opposite has happened, really. We've said one thing and done exactly the opposite. We actually increased capacity, and that led to overfishing and led to economic losses, not simply stocks going down, resources, but led directly to economic losses and job losses too. So we need to be very clear on this. The red line needs to be very, very, very precise. And that's where I find that the proposals that you have made are a little bit contradictory to the objective you've set. When we talk about modernisation, namely, well, it's all very well to say that we should be modernising to be more efficient, but let's remember that one of the problems that we have with the current engines or the problems we have are lack of verification. So if we don't invest in verification or control systems, we're really going to have a problem, because we might end up leaving a loophole open for overcapacity. So I don't think we should be focusing on modernisation as much as beefing up our checking or verification systems. And there's not enough about that in the document. Secondly, when we adopted the report in plenary, there's one key aspect for me, the need to prioritise and to focus our aid on those who are fishing sustainably with good social agreements. That, I think, is what we should be focusing on. And that's where I think we need to be as strong as possible, and that's why we have tabled an amendment which goes in that direction, and think that's what we should be adding to the list, namely we should be promoting selectivity, promoting small-scale fisheries or coastal fisheries too, and getting rid of some activities which are dangerous for the fisheries ecosystem, for stocks, and for the overall situation. Thirdly, and I'm finishing here because we will have a debate on Wednesday with you as well and go into more detail then, but there's a debate which I think is always quite sensible, if you like, and that is how to invest in safety, in health and safety on board. Well, yes, but I think is the answer here. If these investments are linked to an evaluation of to a capacity assessment program, and that member states commit to reducing capacity, because if not, it's a problem. So firstly, you need an assessment, a study of capacity, and I would agree that we haven't really reached a definition that is feasible. We need to work on that. But secondly, if there is not an agreement, a commitment to reducing capacity, then you can't just throw money at it as if nothing has happened. So you need that commitment to avoid the risk that you say that we want to reduce capacity, but the measures that you then implement have the result, the rather perverse result, of increasing capacity, which is not desirable. Thank you.
Gracias, señor Romeva. Señor...
Thank you. Mr. Aguilar, please.
Señora Girling.
Ms. Girling, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Firstly, I'd like to thank Mr. Cadec for his work on this. He's worked very hard, and I'm hugely impressed with the ambitious schedule he's put forward for We Shadows. It's certainly way beyond anything I've worked on in other committees. So I look forward to trying to make most of those dates. My initial reaction, just like most others, to nearly 3,000 amendments has been, well, actually I haven't even had a chance to go through most of them at this stage. So I've really picked out some of the key issues, and clearly the game has completely changed now from where we were before we took the vote in Strasbourg 2 weeks ago, because what we're now looking at is how we checklist the EMFF against the now agreed CFP. And I really think that at every term we have to remind ourselves of that, because our key priority has to be ensuring that these funds are used effectively to implement the CFP, and recognising that the EMFF funds are actually very small. They're very modest in comparison to a number of the much more generously endowed funds in regional development, in the European Social Fund. And we should be absolutely clear that we use the EMFF to support the principles within the CFP, not those other areas such as, I mean, it's always very emotive when you talk about job losses, but we have an ESF that looks after that. We have an agreement that those funds will be leveraged perhaps a bit more precisely than they were in the past to those, and we do not have to use the precious EMFF money for that. So we should be absolutely clear when we're looking at these amendments that we want to use them to do, really, I would reiterate my priorities on this. I'd like to see funding used to improve sustainability. Well, we've all said that, haven't we? But that means meeting those targets on discards and MSY, because quite frankly, a lot of us have had a lot of pain and angst getting through to the fishing communities that we represent, that the proposals that we voted on in the last 2 weeks are actually achievable. So I want to see this money used to making those achievable. That means not just subsidies and money towards selective gear, but also money towards the development of selective gear, towards the science, towards the data collection, towards making sure that having put that gear in place, we actually use the information that we gain to make sure that we do deliver that sustainability that we've all talked about. And that's really then when you look at specific amendments, and I'm looking specifically at one on the temporary cessation of fishing, supporting temporary bans. I really think that that's going in the wrong sort of direction, just to use that as an example, because quite honestly, the cessation of fishing, temporary stopping of fishing, based on reaction to scientific data, just has to become part of the normal meat and drink of a fisherman's lifestyle. That's what sustainable fishing is about. It's about reacting to those things. And I don't think that we can have a direct subsidy every time there's a temporary closure of a fishing grounds. Because if that's based on good scientific data, then that's how it has to work in the future. So we can't be putting forward those sort of subsidies on a regular basis. So I would just like to say that I look forward to working with the rapporteur. We've got a lot to go through. I think we are all singing from the same hymn sheet, but I absolutely agree with Raoul that the devil is in the detail. So we'll be doing close examination of that detail.
Muchas gracias, señor Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson.
Thank you very much. And first of all, let me say that I think Alain Cadec is very brave taking on this job. We have the famous movie now, Les Miserables. I think after we've gone through all of these amendments, we will be Les Miserables in this committee. But I agree exactly with what Julie Girling was saying. We have an extremely limited EMFF, and we have to make sure that it's targeted in the right places. And clearly bycatch avoidance, special gear, and also help with the fitting of CCTV. We voted for that, and that should be something that the fishermen are aided from the EMFF to fit CCTV. In my own report on the CMO, we are asking for help for POs for the implementation of management plans, which you mentioned in your opening remarks. Alain, and I think that's also something that we have to support. I agree entirely with Julie on better science. We need a lot more investment there. We have limited, we have to agree to some limited targeted aid for decommissioning. The Auditor General had a very powerful criticism of the billions that we wasted on decommissioning previously, trying to reduce fleet capacity in the EU, and it failed. It simply failed. And we threw billions of euros of taxpayers' money at it. And the Commission said we shouldn't follow that path again. We should instead have TFCs, and we rejected that in Strasbourg. And therefore, we are leaving the market to dictate the size of fleet capacity. And I cannot support starting to aid uneconomic fisheries. If a fishing business is uneconomic, is running at a loss, then I'm afraid, like any other business in the marketplace, that business has to close. I would agree with Chris Davis, who said there should be limited funding for diversification. I think we can link with structural funds and the EMFF to help fishermen, particularly the small-scale fleet, to spend part of their year, if not all of their year, in the tourist industry, whale watching, dolphin watching, whatever. The conversion of small-scale ports, which could be very costly, but with structural funding aid, I think could be possible. Limited funding towards that, I think, would be a good idea. On aquaculture, I also agree with Mr. Wałęsa. We're only 40% self-sufficient in marine products in Europe. We have to import 60%. That is simply not sustainable. We have to expand our aquaculture sector dramatically in Europe, and that means investment. So I think the one clear message coming from all of this, enough money to start showing modernisation of the fleet. Okay, limited funding for modernising engines. We've said that over 10 metre for the larger boats, provided they reduce capacity by 20% of their engines, we could give them some funding for that in a limited way. For the small-scale fleet, if they retain the same capacity engine or go for a lower capacity engine, we could give them some limited aid there as well. But when you start talking about modernising fishing vessels, remember that we've spent hundreds of millions of euros of taxpayers' money under the old system, rebuilding vessels virtually from the hull and completely renewing them. But those vessels are still, in many member states, registered as the original age of the hull. So we are looking at registration of vessels that apparently are 25 to 30 years old, that have had tens of millions of euros spent on complete modernisation. So I am not going to fall for that again. We must not allow the complete modernisation of vessels, and that shouldn't be allowed to sneak into this debate. So on those strict parameters, Chairman, that's the way that I want to see this debate go. Thank you.
Gracias, señor Stevenson. Señor.
Thank you. Ms. Fraga, please.
Sí, gracias, presidente.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank the rapporteur as well. Firstly, I'd like to look at the definition of small-scale fisheries, given that it came that Ms. Rodust turned down the proposal. Now, we need a compromise for the definition of small-scale fishery. I've got an amendment, but I think the compromise should be the one we go for. But I agree with those who say that the member states should do what they want. I think the definition, there should just be one. We need to improve on the current definition, because I think that having each member state do what they want can give rise to discrimination. between the fleets of different nationalities working in the same areas and under the same management plan. Often small-scale fishery contains positive discrimination, which can lead to the kind of discrimination no one wants. So we need a definition of small-scale fishery across the board. Obviously, I like mine. Regarding the objectives and priorities, I think that in the Commission's proposal, aside from agriculture, they've forgotten the processing industry, and I think it would be good to include the processing industry for the fisheries sector, because that's been left out of this whole reform. Thirdly, regarding Article 13, these non-subsidisable operations, I am against these new things that have come about, new building, because I think that represents a step backwards. And although we're talking about new build, that doesn't mean capacity. Saying that means no capacity rise. That's wrong, because we've seen that capacity has increased as a result. So I am not in agreement with new build in any way. Now, I am in favour of scrapping, because in the initial Commission proposal to reform the CFP, there was a management model that was turned down, but that management plan had the positive effect of a reduction in capacity. Given that that didn't happen laid down in the management plan, which would have had with the individual transferable concessions, there would have been aid for scrapping, and given that the plan is the same as it was, there will be there needs to be this aid, and the fleet itself can't reduce, so that's why additional aid is needed. Now, I don't think there's any other solution, so I'm in favour of aid for scrapping. Regarding temporary bans, I think we need to add detail there where that can happen in certain areas. Now, there has been criticism of this. For example, environmental disasters, oil spills, we've seen in some countries, and some emergency measures are perfectly justified in terms of introducing a temporary ban. Regarding storage aid, this is something that has been improved in the document from Mr. Stevenson, market aid. Mr. Davidson has said about this as well. There are some amendments that want to turn down aid for storage, and I think that needs to carry on, because that's the only safety net left of all those that were in place previously in the market regulation. The withdrawals have gone and so on. The only thing that's remained is storage aid, and I think we need to keep that. Now, I've got a few amendments regarding financing, 1 or 2%. I think we need to stick to the programming schedule. Now, I'm the only one in favour of storage aid during the whole period, whether as opposed to it being retroactive. Regarding diversification, pushing forward diversification and creating jobs, the Commission wants that to be outside the fisheries sector. Some people only want it in the sector. I would like both to have place in and outside the fisheries sector, rather than just sticking to one or the other. And I think that both things can be justifiable in terms of job creation and diversification. There are other importance I'd like to broach, but not for the moment. Thank you, Ms. Rodas.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'd also like to thank Mr. Cadec. I know very well what it means to have to deal with so many amendments, and I'm pleased that cooperation with the shadow rapporteurs has been going so well. I'm grateful, dear Alan, that you have used the basic regulation as the foundation for the future EMFF. Nothing else would be possible, and that's why it is that we delayed the report so long that we were able to use the basic regulation as our basis. Now, you have made selectivity and verification major priorities, which is very good, and those colleagues who were present in Ireland learnt together with us that checks can't be strict enough, because fishermen have really good imaginations, and we were surprised at how good they were at trying to find loopholes. What the Dutch are doing in the Atlantic at the moment is just unbelievable, and that's why we're really going to have to be very, very careful and make sure our controls and checks are good enough to block all of the possible loopholes. Now, I'm sure that the majority of fishermen, nevertheless, want to work honestly and properly. Now, I'm not so much in agreement when you say that we need to be cautious when it comes to competitiveness. If we want to be encouraging fishermen to change vocation, I think that this is similar to agriculture. There are many farmers who've left the trade, and they need to get the chance to train to do something else. Now, this is to do with wording, of course, but if fishermen really want to leave the profession, we need to give them the chance to learn another trade, and there needs to be money to help them to do so. Now, moving on to modernisation of the fleet, I think this is quite a difficult topic. A number of speakers have already touched upon this. Now, just as far as I'm concerned, the fact that a fleet is getting old is not a good enough reason. It's quite clear to me that where there is overcapacity, you can allow for scrapping to take place, and where there is no overcapacity, you can talk about new build, but only there. And that's where the problem starts, of course. The definition of what is overcapacity is something we've not been able to agree on, at least not clearly. We haven't been able to word either to find a clear form of wording for small-scale and artisanal fisheries either. Now, I hope that by way of the Ferreira report we would arrive at a sensible definition of small-scale fisheries, but I don't think we have achieved that. And on these two topics, there's still work to do. But I think, by and large, that we should say yes to scrapping where there is overcapacity. Renewal should only take place where there is no overcapacity. But we need to work on the wording. Thank you.
Gracias, señora Rodus. Señora Patrão.
Thanks, Mrs. Rodus. Mrs. Patrão Neves.
Obrigada, Sr. Presidente.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. When I read the Commission proposal on the EMFF for the first time, I felt it was basically aimed at getting people to leave the profession, and that was very worrying for me. The watchword here, I think, ought to be to fish better. And the rapporteur very sensibly points this out, and I'd like to pay tribute to Alain Cadec for all the work he's done here. And I also wanted to say that I agree, by and large, with everything that the rapporteur has said this afternoon. As I said, the watchword really ought to be fishing better. Fishermen don't need to fish as much, or shouldn't have to fish as much, to get a better income. And that's why we need to bring about the conditions, say, better training of fishermen in actually handling the catch, so that profitability can be greater, so they won't feel the need to fish more, to overfish, because overfishing has only an immediate gain, and that's not even what fishermen want. In the long term, of course, it imperils and jeopardises the stocks that we have. So we need to get our fishermen trained so that they fish better. And I think that can be done through training, and that's why I think this taking the training route is something that this report needs to be very clear about the advantages of. And there's also trying to get young people back into the profession, because we need younger people, we need people who are more open to the conditions under which fishing is carried out in the 21st century. There's also tourist-type activities related to fishing which the older generation didn't really take advantage of as possibilities. And so it's really a question of allowing fishermen to make more money without fishing anymore, without catching any more fish. It's not about the quantity of fish, or shouldn't be about that. It should be about making a decent income. And if fishermen can get something from some decent living from the amount of fish they catch, then the temptation to overfish will disappear. This links, of course, to fisheries conservation and preservation, and that means going the way of scientific research. We need also to work on making methodologies uniform, because not all of these methods are scientific, nor are they all comparable. And we need, therefore, uniform models. That's crucially important, so that we can genuinely compare situations. Because we do have all data gathered in various regions and in different member states, so we can get an overview of the whole picture, an ecosystemic picture, if you like, rather than the position obtaining for a particular species, and that means model uniformity. There's also the question of experimental fishing. That could be a way of raising incomes and reducing pressure on resources. And temporary bans on fishing. I obviously think that's a good idea. Because we're talking about professionals. We're talking about ordinary people who might find themselves in a situation where they can't fish at all. But something needs to be done about that. You can't say to these people, well, never mind, don't eat anything this week, you can eat next week instead. So something needs to be done if various fishing areas are to be closed off. But the important thing is to allow fishermen to live in dignity. And the idea of allowing fishermen to leave the profession is also a way of reducing pressure on resources. We've heard about the modernisation of vessels. This is something which I think could be linked to logistical improvements in ports as a way of promoting safety on board. It's not just a question of whether boats are old or not. There are some fleets that have renewed and some which haven't. The Portuguese one, for example, hasn't. And I think we all agree that fishing effort shouldn't be increased, but we need to look at these issues on a case-by-case basis. I don't think either that you can just have some kind of a la carte fund when it comes to modernising or renewing vessels. It needs to be weighed, as I said, on a case-by-case basis, but looked upon favourably if there's any safety question as far as seafarers are concerned. improving ports, logistical conditions in ports. That's even more important when we talk about banning discards. I'm from an outlying region, and there are 9 islands in the Azores where fishing takes place, and at the moment there wouldn't be any facilities to deal with these discards in any of the 9 ports in the Azores. You wouldn't be able to tell what had been done with them. There's a lack, for example, of processing industry in the Azores which could handle the discards. Trying to keep it brief, Mr. Chairman, there are some points which are very important in Mr. Cadec's report. I agree what was said on support for small-scale fishing, and I would say it's even more important in areas which are highly dependent on fishing, particularly outermost regions. If you're talking about an island with 300 people living on it, which depends on fishing, you can't take fishing away from that island because it will become a desert. Storage of catches. Carmen Fraga agrees on that. It's vitally important, I think, because that's the last way we can intervene. It's our last resource as far as intervention is concerned. And I wanted to point out another point in favour, because it allows us to reintroduce fisheries products onto the market when stocks are less abundant or demand is greater, which means more advantage can be taken of catches. We shouldn't forget that aspect, because it does touch on the aspect of fishing better, of making more from the same amount of catching. I agree with what was said about something that's lacking in the Commission's proposal, and we need to bring it back in. Aquaculture is absolutely vital for the European economy and for European fishing in general. Over and above the other points that have been made, it would also reduce the pressure on stocks. There would be less pressure on wild fish. And finally, the CCRs, I agree with that. Regionalisation is the way to go. Decentralisation is the way to go. We need to give a bigger role. At the moment, there's just advisory committees at the moment. And what we need to do is give the RACs the way of actually discharging the new duties that are going to be given to them. Thank you. Mr. García Hierro. Mrs. García Hierro, sorry. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Cadec, for your understanding position. Obviously, an enormous number of amendments have been tabled, but you will have had a chance to look at them, and I'm sure you'll be able to sift the wheat from the chaff. Sometimes a lot of amendments are tabled, but it's the content, not the number, that's important. I want to keep this brief because also, well, you've asked us to make an effort in terms of not tabling too many amendments and making your job easier. And the Spanish delegation wants to make, or at least I want to make, Mr. Cadec's job easier, because you have very democratically tried to allow us all to express views that are particularly important to our delegations. And I agree with a lot of the ideas that have been made. And the most important thing is that the fund should never be designed to increase fishing capacity. But the use of funds can be very wide as our needs, fishing capacities or fishing needs or aquaculture needs throughout Europe, because it's not just a monolith, it's a mosaic made of 27 different fishing industries. And there's an amendment I wanted to mention, one which I, in fact, tabled, but it was defeated with the assistance of my own group, the support for small-scale coastal fishing. I think it's crucially important. We shouldn't leave them out. I've looked at the Court of Auditors reports, and it appears that there wasn't sufficient take-up by the people who are most skilled at taking advantage of these funds, who turn to be the big operators. They're the ones who are best able to shape their projects and able to put the case for modernisation or scrapping, and they actually often replace the scrapped vessel with a brand new one, which is odd. We're talking about reducing capacity after all, and so one would think that that was not the way to go. But modernising is a criterion which you've mentioned, but it shouldn't be to introduce or to increase capacity. We're already at overcapacity. We don't need to increase that. But we need to look at the adaptation of vessels to meet new stringent health and safety conditions and environmental conditions. We could have clean engines that don't emit CO2 with lower ratings. There are all sorts of ways that we can come up with an approach so we can deal with all the diversity of fishing without further increasing overcapacity. But there's something which we shouldn't forget about small-scale coastal fishing, because it is a kind of poor relation. But because they're smaller, more diverse, they often end up losing out, and I fear that'll be the case here. That's my opinion, Chairman, and that's why I would really ask you very warmly, Mr. Cadec, about thinking about incorporating my amendment into your report. I've also got something on 48, where there should be money made available for vocational training for young people and women as part of non-discrimination, and also looking at persons with disabilities, provided, of course, the conditions allow them to do so, not just in fishing or aquaculture, but also in processing. I agree with that whole approach. And also there's the question of funds which can step in and help when there's reconversion, when areas which are particularly badly hit by unemployment, we're in a crisis, there's a reform of the CFP going on, and so it's important that particular areas, because there are some areas which live exclusively on fisheries, of course, and so we could help those areas if we can train people, reskill them so that they can make a different kind of living. Surely the Renault kind of plan, for example, isn't that a kind of subsidy? We're talking now about non-polluting electronic cars. Sometimes there's a temptation to think that only agriculture and fisheries get subsidies, but that's not right. We do need to invest so that we get more people checking on how fishing is carried out. We have more scientific data, and we agree with that. Another amendment clearly mentions that if there is a natural disaster, assistance has to be provided. You can't just let fishermen take their chances. That's just not on. You really can't say in a responsible way that it's up to fishermen. Why don't we do the same in other sectors if we're going to do that to fishermen? So we're talking about various objectives and criteria. Sometimes we're not talking about large amounts of money. People think that's the case, but it's not. We should be talking about criteria which would allow access to the fund. And one of them, competitiveness. That's very important, because it doesn't have to lead to over-exploitation. It doesn't have to lead to environmentally unfriendly fishing gear being used. It's simply a question that with more investment, vessels or operators or the more efficient companies are always the ones at the front of the queue when the funds are being handed out. Why not have it ones that come rewarded for being environmentally or socially responsible? And obviously someone's got the task of going through all of these amendments, and as I said, you might think that there's probably too many of them. But obviously it's important that we make our voices heard in this Parliament, and it's really only through reports like this, when key decisions are taken, that we can actually have an impact, and that's why it's worth the effort. I'm willing to withdraw some of my less important ones as long as the key ones are backed. Thank you. Mr. Ferreira.
Obrigado, Presidente.
Thank you, Chairman. Let me make a general observation first, and then I will talk about some of the specific amendments which my group's tabling. If we look at the original Commission proposal, you can only really, if you're looking at it in a very favourable light, say it's a fisheries fund at all. It's basically a fund which organises a fleeing from the sector, an abandonment of the sector. The rapporteur's proposals, at least in part, do offset some of the bad aspects of the proposal, but only in part. I think that things have improved, but I think that we can, and indeed should, go further in correcting the flaws and missteps in the Commission proposal. There are an awful lot of amendments tabled by my group, about 150. I'm only going to mention a few of them. Others have already been referred to by previous speakers. Obviously, getting young people, young fishermen involved in the industry. It's an ageing sector in very many countries, of course. And let me just go back a bit and say this is the biggest problem with the proposal. It closes its eyes to the massive diversity which is what marks European fisheries. When it talks about the fleet, about the resources, about the actual vessels, the characteristics of each fleet, the kind of gear that's used, this changes massively from country to country. And this regulation closes its eyes to that diversity almost completely. The average age of the fleet was mentioned. Well, that changes depending on what country you're in. So, I think that, unfortunately, this regulation, already happened with the basic regulation, forgets about the diversity which is hugely important in Europe. I mentioned getting new or young fishermen into the profession. It's a profession that wears you out. We've got an ageing sector, and if we don't make sure we get young people involved in the medium term, the profession will die out completely. The Commission does seem to have realised that it made a mistake there, and recently the Commissioner in plenary said that she was ready to do something about correcting that oversight in the initial proposal, allowing new fishermen to come into the profession. Then there's the question of land or port infrastructures. Obviously, again, the situation varies considerably from country to country. Today, we can look around, particularly in areas where there's a lot of small-scale fishing going on and coastal fishing going on. There's often a lack of decent support structures, either in landing places, markets or ports. Markets are crucially important if people are going to actually make decent money after all of the hard work that they've put in. Also, other supports after the initial processing of fish has been carried out, and the regulation doesn't mention any of that. The rapporteur does well to address some of those problems, and we've tabled some amendments to go even further and look at the need for infrastructure support on land, which will help the activity, particularly, as I said, in those areas where there's a lot of small-scale coastal fishing going on. There's also the safety aspect as well. That's when I'm talking about the building of new fishing ports. And on the question of safety, there's the question of replacing engines. There are vital, pressing needs to replace motors or engines, I beg your pardon, in some particularly small-scale fishing. It can be done for coastal fishing in particular. And every year, don't forget, in European waters, fishermen die. They are risking their lives to go fishing, because it's a question of going fishing or going hungry. And we're talking about highly depressed coastal areas, a situation where the crisis has hit particularly hard in social and economic terms. There's a lot of segmentation of the small-scale fishing industry. And so today there are overriding safety requirements as far as engine replacement is concerned. So having general principles which ignore those situations is wrong. It's just incorrect as far as my group's concerned, and that part of the Commission proposal has to be corrected. As far as biological bans is concerned, obviously there are sound scientific reasons, even in situation where there's not a case of overcapacity. It's still just sensible that for a certain period, during spawning periods, etc., that there be a biological ban on fishing. And this is something that the scientific community has accepted very broadly. It's vitally important if we're going to manage stocks sustainably. As other colleagues have said, obviously fishermen need to be able to live when they're not able to fish. So this irregular nature of fishing activity and the importance, the social importance and the public importance of it, since it guarantees Europe's food supply, needs to address the question of fishermen's incomes when they're not allowed to fish. Data gathering. This was mentioned by Mr. Cadec in his initial statement. Other speakers have touched upon it too. It's vitally important that we learn more about the state of resources. Fishing policies, which we're defining for the next few years today, are built upon considerable ignorance of the state of our resources and the health of stocks in various areas. We need to make sure, of course, that the Union will foot the bill for this. We can't have a common policy, but member states are then going to be asked to pay for the policy individually. If we're talking about a Union policy and resources owned by the Union, then the Union should actually pay for that policy, the cost of that policy, or at least pay a large share of those costs. And although the rapporteur's proposal for increasing community participation in data gathering, he doesn't go far enough, and I've made a proposal to increase the figures given by Mr. Cadec a little more. Just one more minute, if I may, Chairman, as one other point, I want to mention small-scale coastal fishing. It's, I think, universally recognised how important small-scale fishing is. We've got a specific report dealing with that. It makes various recommendations, some of which have a practical impact, and the amendments are being copied and tabled for this report too. And I just want to commend these two colleagues, but particularly when it comes to providing greater levels of support, more than the Commission is proposing. We've put forward our own amendment which improves on the original Commission position. It's based on the debate we had on small-scale fishing and builds in some criteria, particularly the question that goes beyond the actual size of a boat, and we need to improve that definition still further. Aquaculture, if I can just say something about that very quickly. Again, the huge diversity of member states needs to be reflected. Obviously, it's fine to have new innovative forms of aquaculture, offshore aquaculture, but offshore aquaculture simply can't be carried out in a large number of member states. We don't have conditions in many member states there's no technical or scientific possibility of carrying out offshore aquaculture in certain member states. So if we're saying we're only going to support those kinds of aquaculture, then that means we're condemning certain member states not to have any aquaculture. The whole of the Atlantic side of the EU simply can't carry out aquaculture. And emergency situations, I beg your pardon, emergency situations, it's important that we have mechanisms which will guarantee support in, say, natural disasters. This is also part of the report on small-scale fishing. For a long time now, the EU budget has had ways of responding to natural disasters which affect agriculture that's not available for fisheries. But it's just as subject, just as vulnerable as agriculture is to extreme weather events and other kinds of natural disaster. And we need to make sure that those needs are reflected. Thanks very much, Chairman.
Señor Ferreira, señora Levin.
Thank you, Ms. Levin.
Thank you, Chair, and Alain, for your report. And you're sure going to have a huge workload ahead of you on all these amendments. My colleague Raul already mentioned the most important points for the Greens, so I'm not going to go into all the details. Just first of all, I mean, I think we should all congratulate ourselves on the vote last week in plenary, where we all decided that we want to rebuild stocks above those levels that can produce MSY, which will actually lead to more profitable fisheries for all European fishermen. And if you look at Norway or Iceland or New Zealand, where stocks actually are abundant, they don't have any kind of subsidies to their fishermen. And Iceland, as you may know, one of their big problems with their concession negotiations with the EU is that they don't want to get into this system of having subsidies to their fishermen. Good for them, yes, absolutely. But
fisheries are different.
We need to be very clear that the objective of the European Fisheries Fund is to implement the new common fisheries policy in a sustainable manner. One of the things that I regret a little bit is the interpretation of CO2 reduction. I know this is one element that needs to be in all the EU regulations. It's the EU 2020 strategy. We need to reduce CO2 emissions. And the interpretation that reducing CO2 emissions in fisheries is only done by replacing engines to more fuel-efficient engines, I think that's a wrong interpretation. And the Greens put an amendment 1385 talking about promoting fishing methods which are less energy intensive. I think that's very important because the difference between different fishing methods in terms of CO2 emissions is enormous. So if you're trawling, you're emitting a lot, I mean, a lot more fuel than if you're fishing with passive gears. So I think that's also important. And one other thing that could be done with the European Maritime Fund is restoring seagrass beds and coastal wetlands, which is also absorb big carbon sinks where you can actually absorb CO2 through sustainable management of coastal wetlands, which I think is something we should not forget. Another thing is our Amendment 310, talking about the fish stock recovery areas, which we all agreed upon in the Rodust report. So that will also need some funding to be implemented, and I think that is also very important, and I think also that will contribute to CO2 emission reductions, that you actually have areas where you don't go fishing, which will restore the ocean and also increase its possibility of absorbing CO2. Another thing which unfortunately did not get adopted in the Rodust report was our amendments on reducing negative impacts on animal welfare, the fisheries activities, negative impacts on animal welfare. But I think there's an opportunity here to, in the fund, actually support some projects to try to develop fishing methods that are less let's say, damaging to animal welfare. And I'm talking both about bycatches of seabirds, marine mammals, and all unnecessary animal suffering. And I think that could be something that should be supported by all the groups. It's our amendments 608 and 1288. And finally, our amendment 775 is talking about no investments to be given to those segments, no subsidies should be given to those segments where the member states have not proven that there's a balance between the capacity and the available resources. I mean, in other words, we should not give taxpayers money for fuel efficiency or whatever, security, whatever, selectivity, not anything, until we know that the capacity is in balance with the available resources. Otherwise, we first give money for investments, and then perhaps we should get rid of those vessels after the investments have been done. This is a politic that has been going on for far too long time in the European Union and which must be ended. And I think I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Gracias, señora Rubin. Señora Thomas.
Thomas.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci, Monsieur le rapporteur. Donc, j'ai bien.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you to the rapporteur. I think we need to get to the heart of the matter. There are 5 points I'd like to mention. Firstly, I can agree with Mrs. Levine when she started her intervention by saying the objective of this fund is to help fishermen move their activities towards sustainability. Now, there's an error in the translation of my Amendment 307, where in English we use the words fuel efficiency, where it should really be energy efficiency that's mentioned. Now, having said that, though, there is, Rapporteur, a series of points where I think we will be able to quickly reach agreement, in particular increasing data and verification, which I think is going to be very important. On the question of data, it's the only way that the precautionary principle won't end up becoming the rule to be used for everything. Secondly, I think that we can also agree on the idea of regionalisation, even if, by way of these 2 questions, as one of our colleagues has said, the devil can very much be in the detail on both of those issues. And I think that a large number of amendments, though, are singing from the same hymn sheet on those 2 points. Now, we've had a first debate on the question of diversification. Now, I share the rapporteur's view and the view of a number of amendments that have come in from other members as well. There's a real problem of how you define diversification on the one hand and multiplicity of or having a portfolio of several different activities on the other. polyvalence, as it were. Now, I think that the fisheries sector is one that the European Union can be proud of, nevertheless. And if we don't support it, we'll see our fisheries imports coming in from countries outside of the EU. Another point of discussion which I think is important on the question of port subsidies. Well, I think that after the vote in Strasbourg, and because the European Union has decided to make have a ban on discards, I think that it would be the straw that breaks the camel's back if they said that it's local authorities who have to bear the cost of that decision, even if local and regional authorities are the owners of port infrastructures and they're going to be active in other domains. I think that we need to help them with implementing the discard ban in the EMFF. Now, on the question of fleet renewal, well, everybody wants young people to follow in their parents' footsteps. I think all members of Parliament say that youth is a priority, an absolute priority for the European Union. But then, when it's time to move from words to deeds, all of a sudden everybody seems to become reticent. Now, the rapporteur launched the debate here, and Chris Davis and Mr. Romeva i Rueda and Mrs. Rodust as well. How do you get young people interested in getting onto a fishing boat that's 25 or 30 years old and actually working, in miserable conditions on these old boats, in safety conditions which are really poor? This is a sector where work accidents are very high. This is a sector where industrial accidents are high, and also where fatal accidents are very high. So those are three important factors. Now, Mr. Davis talked about profitability, but in order to be profitable as a fisherman, you need to be able to find a balance. If we say that people should be fishing less, and I share that idea, then at the same time, you're talking about less quantity, but profitability needs to be enough to take account of that. And if we want profitability, then we need people to be able to renew their fishing boats. Energy efficiency is key, selectivity as well, but also being able to process fish on board, for example. So fleet renewal is important. Capacity and overcapacity is relevant. So we need to answer that question too. The rapporteur has asked it, and we have a real problem of definitions here too. The Parliament has carried out a study which confirms the fact there isn't a proper definition here. Everybody has said that we haven't managed to harmonise between the member states or reach agreement on the question of what capacity is, what overcapacity is. It's a relevant question to ask whether that capacity should be calculated in an overall manner. People are saying, well, there's European overcapacity. Well, maybe there is, but should we be splitting that up zone by zone, fishery by fishery? We know that some species are under threat, that, in some areas there may be overcapacity, but in other areas not at all. So can you make an overall package and lump everyone together? You might be actually being unfair if you did that, calling people to reduce capacity where there isn't any overcapacity. So I think we need to look at overcapacity in a more nuanced way and not just say there's overcapacity, full stop, finish. We need to be more subtle than that. So I'm going to leave it there because I think I've gone over my speaking time. But from my point of view, I have tabled some amendments on a table of sustainability to go along the lines of what Mr. Romeva y Rueda had said. The idea being you would allow professionals who are actually doing what they can to improve selectivity, to improve energy efficiency, reducing CO2 emissions, and doing what they can in health and safety on board and training and so on, that they could actually get better assistance from the EMFF compared to those who don't do all of those things. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Gallagher, finally, please.
I've come in a little bit late, so I'm not going to dwell on a lot of the issues that were raised previously, but suffice it to say that our group, as has been indicated by my colleagues, fully in support of funding for data, dealing with enforcement, dealing with marketing and discards. And it's not just enough to say we want funding to deal with discards. I think it's very simple. We have, of course, to ensure that we minimise and avoid discards, and therefore to do that it may well be necessary to provide incentives to fishermen, both large and small scale, to change their nets to the type that would ensure that the small fish will be left in the sea rather than taking them ashore and into fish meal plants. I have a very strong view about small ports, island communities. I believe that we have to be radical. I think the word may have been used earlier today that, there's nothing radical about this. All we're asking the rapporteur, and of course at the end of the day it will be our report when it goes through, to provide funding for these small, and all we have to do is go to any of the member states and look at the very small ports that is, as a result of the reduction in quotas, and they have very little, and hopefully that each member state come after the review, which I think has been included in it very clearly. The vast majority of the Parliament want to give special recognition to the coastal communities and to the islands. So therefore, infrastructure there isn't up to the standard that it should be. And we're not talking about big money. We're only talking about a small investment to carry out improvements to those ports, to bring them up into this century, never mind this decade. So I believe we must do that. We must provide some funds for ice-making facilities. I mean, it's not huge money. It's small money depending on it. The ice-making facilities can be commensurate with the size of the port and the number of vessels that are landing there. So I would ask and plead with Mr Cadec to do this. I don't think it's sufficient to say, well, we haven't a very big budget, we must focus on other things. If we're going to focus on the majority of fishermen, the majority of fishers are in this section. Small ports, islands, coastal communities. And we're not creating something that's new. All we have to do is look at the CAP budget, the Common Agricultural Budget, that there is funding ring-fenced there for leader programmes. And there are a lot of programmes, the leader programmes, they're helping small communities, and it mightn't be directly involved in agriculture at all. So we should be looking at the same, and there is a template there. And of course, we can also try to take their template into consideration, and that fund is not 100%. It's about 55%, 45%, and I think member state governments have a responsibility to contribute to these small adjustments in piers and harbours and providing the necessary facilities. The other one, of course, and we talk continuously about the large percentage of fish that's coming from outside the European Union. We have a golden opportunity to do something about that, to ensure that we have import substitution, and that is to develop aquaculture. And I can't point the finger at the European Commission for the delays. It takes far too long. And every country, from the time it's at the embryonic stage right through. Why? Because there are too many agencies dealing with this. But I believe that there should be some funding provided there as well. And I know that I'm going out into a gale force wind when I mention the next issue, and that's targeted decommissioning. And I know decommissioning is not the flavour of the month or the year here, but we have to differentiate and we have to learn from the past, because there's parts of the European Union that got funding for decommissioning in the past, total waste of money. And we have to compare that when we had targeted decommissioning, as we had in my own country, and it made the vessels that stayed within the system, they had a larger quota, and it's much more sustainable. But I know I'm going into a Gale Force 1, but I'll continue to mention it in the hope that some will see sense someday and do that even at a small percentage. So thanks for your time.
Gracias, señor Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher. Well, having heard from the MEPs, let me give the floor to Mr. Pennis from the Commission, followed by Mr. Cadec to answer. Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank you for all your comments and ideas, and I hope Mr. Cadec's work goes well, given the huge amount of problems linked to this 2,800 amendments. Now, I'm not going to try and respond to all of the issues raised or the questions. That would take too long, but if I may, I'd like to just set out the philosophy and the principle underlying the Commission's examination of the various draft amendments tabled under discussion. Generally speaking, this European Fund for Fisheries and Maritime Affairs, the Maritime and Fisheries Fund, as with all structural funds from the Commission, the aim of them is to implement the 2020 strategy. And that means that this money is in order to promote the necessary change as opposed to keeping things as they are, as and where things are unsustainable. So that's the philosophy underpinning our ideas. Looking at the change that we need, obviously there is a political process underway for the basic regulation, but I think there are clear priorities set, and aside from the specific details that are being negotiated still, I think everyone agrees, no one disagrees, that we need to move fisheries towards MSYs. We all agree that discards are a problem to be solved. We all agree that we rely heavily on fisheries imports, and aquaculture may help to make up that deficit. We all want coastal communities that depend on fishery that, aside from active, reliable fisheries, have other activities which help to create jobs in those areas. And I think we all certainly agree that we need to have correct CFP governance with the right resources, the right scientific backup, and so on. So I think we all agree on those priorities, Chair. The Commission believes that the more we put into the regulation in terms of measures, then we're going to have less money to feed into the real priorities. So from the Commission's point of view, it's not only important for the fund to concentrate on the priorities, but for it not to be concentrated on two things. Two things we don't want it for. It shouldn't, we believe, be for repeating the errors of the past, or for trying to artificially keeping situations afoot that aren't sustainable. And those are the two things we rule out. And just to give you an example, this is something we put to you to think about, but with a small fund like ours, we think it's important for us to concentrate on having enough money to fund priorities. Some speakers have talked about including port infrastructure intervention, processing. The Commission agrees that that investment's important. It's very important. But that kind of investment can be funded from elsewhere with regional development funds. Why would we use our small fund, the money we've got in that, to fund things that can be funded elsewhere from much bigger pots of money. That clearly shows what's important for us at the Commission. We need to concentrate the limited resources of this fund to try and deal properly with the priorities. Thank you.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you. Mr. Cadec, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Well, everyone's spoken that wanted to. I've listened carefully to everyone's comments, which obviously cover people's own amendments. One point for Mr. Penas, Ernesto. I think we should stop, and this is to do with you, Chair, I think we should stop saying, well, the Commission's small, the financing's small, everything's small regarding the PESH committee. I've had enough of hearing this because we are a lawmaking committee. There are big committees in this Parliament. That and others. There are some that aren't to do with lawmaking, but we do work on legal committees. So we shouldn't say we're a small committee, we're a full committee. But Ernesto, I'm picking up on what you were saying. You're not the one that's opened this to question, but some colleagues do say this sometimes at the Parliament. And I get a bit fed up of hearing this. So I'm getting this off my chest. In any case, colleagues, you're as aware of this as me, that not everyone is always on the same wavelength. But I do think that we can move together towards consensus, but on one condition, which I think is essential. Raoul? One essential condition, Raoul. And this is to do with ideology. I think this is essential. At our wonderful Fisheries Committee, well, I'm not exaggerating. You're wonderful MEPs, you do good work, that's why I say that. But in this committee, beautiful committee, we should oppose those who want to kill the fisheries sector. We shouldn't put the North and South against each other, those that want public powers to get involved and those that don't. The good and the bad, as it were. Those people who want to destroy the oceans and those who want to preserve them. It would be far too easy to polarise everything. I think we all want to have sustainable European fisheries. But, colleagues, with the meetings that we've had with the shadows, with you, the members, we'll be working on this. And there's a lot to be done in order to do this. I've worked with my colleagues towards compromises. We need something coherent, constructive, and I hope so everyone will find their views reflected. So the EMFF report will be an exemplary one. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Muy bien, gracias, señor Cadec.
Thank you, Mr. Cadec. Well, we've got a lot to do. Next item on the agenda, 17. Establishing a community system to prevent and deter and eliminate IUU fishing. We've had an initial exchange of views in November, and Mr. Romeva, the rapporteur, will be presenting to us his draft report. Mr. Romeva, you have the floor.
Sí, muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Adelante, señor.
Sí.
As I said in a previous meeting, Chairman, it's a report is part of what we call Lisbonisation. It's really a technical legal matter, and so the report in legislative terms is very simple. All I've done is propose one amendment, which is to do with the timetable under which delegated acts can be adopted on a series of articles and paragraphs, and to follow the logic which we've followed in other cases, we mention a 3-year period for that, etc., etc. It's merely keeping in line with other reports which deal with Lisbonisation. So it's maintaining a certain level of consistency, if you like. That's the legislative part of the report, Chairman. But there's an important point we need to remember, which is that the topic in itself does, of course, have a large political element in it. We're talking about illegal fishing and ways of doing something about it. IUU fishing. So, we're talking about an issue that's got a lot of fronts still open, if I can call it that. It's no coincidence that after many years and a lot of opposition and interference that the Commission recently did actually come up with a list of 8 countries which it considers as non-cooperative or insufficiently cooperative in the battle against IUU fishing. And as I said before and can repeat today, that's a good thing. It's a good first step, but it is no more than a first step. And it doesn't go far enough. So, and this is where I think we should really be urging the Commission, we need to get them to work in a more decisive way. They have begun now, but they've got this list of 8 countries, and let's just say by way of aside that they're not the main culprits as far as the volume of IUU fishing is concerned, but we should also see added to the list those countries which terms of influence or capacity do have a big impact. I'm thinking of Korea, Russia, the Philippines, and China, of course, needs to be mentioned. That's the elephant in the room. And perhaps we should name and shame them as well. This is, as I said before, just a first list, a kind of yellow card, not even a red card, because it's just a warning, and so an awful lot of work remains to be done. That's why I think we do have a chance in the form of this report, or the debate rather than report, to remind the Commission, as we've done aside, by way of an aside, that the credibility of the EU on IUU fishing is at stake here. And if the Union wants to be credible when calling on other countries to be responsible when it comes to fishing, and if we simultaneously are importing products where there are minute guarantees as far as social and environmental aspects are concerned, we can't really set ourselves up as the great anti-IUU movement. That's the biggest challenge which the European Commission has. Obviously, there are some countries where they will be unhappy if we move in this direction. There are some countries which, when it comes to defending the environment, talk a very good game, but when it comes to actually applying economic and political measures, actually to do so, are a bit less forward. I'm thinking of the UK, first of all, here. And it's necessary, therefore, that we be very clear about who's stopping us improving things. But, as I said, Chairman, this is basically just a Lisbonisation report, but the debate behind it, if you like, is very significant. But I'm pleased to see Mr. Penas here and the Commission, so perhaps he will take heed of the call, not just to broaden the list in terms of number of countries on it, but also the more sensitive aspect, the actual vessels which are suspected of being involved in IUU fishing. And by way of conclusion, Mr. Chairman, let me say that the Parliament's commissioned a study. I don't know, I must admit, precisely when we think it's going to be ready, so when we'll be able to use its conclusions, but it deals with imports of fish and aquaculture products under IUU regulations. This is an important topic, and it's an important topic because we need to make sure that this regulation be a key element in European fisheries policy. So it's important that when we're drafting my report that we always remember that the main goal shouldn't be to drain this regulation of meaning, but if we change it a bit, we can actually make it into an even stronger instrument. Now, it's important that when this study is being carried out, they bear in mind what the goals of the regulation are and the people who are against it. We don't want to fall into the trap of seeing people talking up the system, whereas at the same time they're actually trying to get rid of it because they don't want to see any checks on IUU. This is far from being a trivial matter. It's very important, and that's why it's significant that we get a chance to talk about this study. I don't know whether you know precisely how it stands with the study, Mr. Chairman, and when we can expect to see it. Perhaps the Secretariat can help out on that, but it's something that would be very useful. The Chairman, thank you very much, Mr. Romeva. Mrs. Fraga. Thank you, Chairman. I've got some doubts here, and I'd like to tell Mr. Romeva about them, and he can inform me as to whether the Commission is keeping them in their proposal. And perhaps I'm wrong, but I would like to stress Article 12C, the catch certification regulation for catches from small vessels, because I'm not sure whether these fall under delegated acts, and various member states think that this should be under co-decision as well. I've noted down that 6 member states, not including Spain, let me point that out in passing, are asking for that to be dealt with under co-decision. Now, I'm not certain whether we are leaving this as delegated acts, so I don't want to be a bore about it, but I do have my doubts. 16.1, now this should definitely be an implementing provision and not a delegated act. No need to have a delegated act there at all. I also have doubts on this list of non-cooperating countries, 33.1, 34.1, suspension of countries from the list. Now, I can understand that sometimes, because we're in a hurry, countries get bumped off the list, but the list of non-cooperating countries, as Mr. Romeva said, is extremely important. And Parliament is, to say the least, doubtful about whether the Commission's really doing its job as well as it can, as quickly as it can. I don't think many member states agree with this being dealt with under delegated acts. So once again, Mr. Romeva, can you tell me whether we leave it, whether we are right if we leave it in delegated acts? But I really have a lot of doubt about that one too. And then there's something else. Well, no, actually, that's all I was mainly. Well, no, you mentioned the 3-year period. I agree with you on that. But on the other topics, I know that we agree on many aspects of the fight against IUU fishing, and if you tell me that these things are better off as delegated acts, then that's fair enough, but I'd just like you to tell me whether I'm right or wrong, because it's not just a question of the Council. The Council, in many cases, put them as implementing acts, and in a larger number of cases, puts them under co-decision. So can the right way forward really be through delegated acts? But I'd really like to see some clarification here, because I'm a bit antsy about this, because I'm worried about the whole process here. Thanks, Mrs. Fraga. No one else wants to take the floor on this, so I turn to the Commission and then Mr. Romeva to wind up. Mr. Romeva. Thank you, Chairman. I can understand the rapporteur in saying that over and above the actual legislative aspect of this, which is simply not changing this into a new regulation, but making it a Lisbon-era regulation, if you like, that we need to bear in mind how important this is. I think I've made that point more than once in your committee, sir. We are fully aware of how important IUU fishing is, but also, to justify the fact that it's been taking quite a long time, it's important that we don't make any mistakes in adapting this, mistakes which might lead to the Commission being taken to court, because if we take hasty decisions, if we make it easy for people to take us to court and win, then the IUU regulation will lie in ruins. So for you and for us as well, or even more, if I might say so, sometimes it's very depressing that we have to move so slowly on these points, but we do sometimes have to go slowly to make sure that everything is solid and neat, and the risk of ending up in court is minimal. So it's important that honourable members be aware of this, because if we go too quickly, we're setting ourselves up for a court case which we might lose. And we don't want the IUU regulation to end up like that. On the points mentioned by Mrs. Fraga, 16.1, as far as we see it, is a kind of amendment to the Basic Act. So it's legislative to a certain extent in nature. And if it's legislative to a certain extent, then we think it should be a delegated act. 33, however, here, that's purely implementation. So when we talk about implementation, no new elements are being introduced into the regulation, and there's no new assessment, it's just implementation. So that's an implementation act. I don't know whether Mrs. Fraga's convinced by that. I do hope so.
Señor Romeva, gracias.
Thanks very much, Mr. Pena. Mr. Romeva. Well, briefly, Chairman, thank you. I understand the problems the Commission's having, and so much groundwork needs to be done so that we don't lay ourselves open to some action. But I would say that the Commission should, it's not a dig at Mr. Pena, but the Commission in general should have more resources and more staff devoted to matters like this, because it's very, very important. And it's to stop that kind of thing happening, that's why we need to have more capacity, so as to be able to see these situations coming and avoid them. It links into the Cadet report and the debate we've just had on that. It's a question of where the priorities are when it comes to spending public money when it comes to fisheries policy. On the points raised by Mrs. Fraga, the only goal I looked at was workability, if you like, I have to confess. How can we be most effective in carrying out certain measures, some of which are highly complex and some of which are eminently political? And I've got some doubts, I must admit, on certain possible politicisation of certain issues. We need to be able to respond rapidly, and we don't always, in this House, respond to external events as quickly as we ought to do. And although I don't always agree with the Commission here, I have to say that we're not really massively rushed on this, so I'd like another week for the tabling of amendments so that I can get together with Mrs. Fraga and negotiate on the points that she's raised, and it wouldn't stop us from moving forward. If we can, Chairman, it wouldn't stop us from moving forward on the report. I think it's really just a question of appreciation which we'll be able to sort out fairly quickly. Mrs. Fraga, did you want to say something? No, anyway. The deadline for the tabling of amendments was going to be the 25th of February at noon, but I don't think there's any problem, as Mr. Romeva said, so we'll put it back by a week, if that's all right. No one minds? No one's objecting? No. No objections to that.
In that case, we will put off the amendments deadline by a week. And tomorrow we'll be able to look at that again, and we'll put off the plenary vote again if necessary. Moving on to 7. Regulation 1100 of the Council. Measures for repopulation of the European eel. Now, last October, there was a presentation from the Commission, and in January we had an initial exchange of views on this proposal. Ms. Levin is the rapporteur, and today we will be looking at the draft report from the rapporteur. So I'd like to give you the floor, Ms. Levin.
Thank you very much, Chair. Well, first of all, I'd like to apologise to colleagues because there are some minor errors in the report because of an error made by the Secretariat, where the last version of the report was not sent to translation, but the version that was before that. So that we had spotted at least 3 places where it's not the text as we intended it to go away. So I'll come back to that. Anyway, so this has been a real challenge to deal with this dossier, because of course it's a Lisbonization report and should be that. On the other hand, with the new scientific reports concerning the status of the eel stock, and well, it's wrong to say new, but they're continuing to come each year from CITES, emphasising more and more the extremely urgent status of the eel stock. It's very difficult to just sit back and do a pure Lisbonization of this regulation that has, since quite a number of years, already proven not to be taking all the scientific data into consideration that has come up. And already back in 2007, the European eel was included in CITES Annex 2, although it was clearly qualified for Annex 1, which would have completely stopped all trade of this acutely endangered animal. CITES last year, for the first time, spoke about this measure about restocking, which the regulation is relying quite heavily on, allowing restocking as one of the measures for the member states to try to achieve the target of 40% escapement of silver eels from each member state. ICES is now very, very cautious about the restocking measure. First of all, they're not absolutely not sure that there is any surplus of glass eels in any eel river basin in Europe anymore that can be translocated. And basically, the mortality during fishing, the mortality during translocation is also very high. There's in the eel recovery plan, the regulation, there's no provisions whatsoever, no conditions whatsoever on the conditions on restocking that needs to be taken into account. So member states have used this a lot. Some member states have started using it after the eel recovery plan came into force, which they didn't do before that. So in fact, glass eel fisheries has increased since. And what makes it absolutely impossible for me to just stay inside the lines of a Lisbonization is the trade figures. So, as you may know, 1 kilo of glass eels could be sold for 600 euros, 600-700 euros. And since the CITES listing came into force in 2009, international trade of glass eels or any eels is prohibited. It's because it's an acutely endangered animal, so it's not allowed. But what we discovered during the process of drafting this report is that the trade numbers do not match with the catch numbers. So what it seems is that at least 2 member states, France and Spain, they have large amounts of glass eel catches unaccounted for. So putting those 2 countries together, it's 15.7 tons of glass eels that is unaccounted for now. Knowing that, we're talking about 15,700 kilos of glass eels with an estimated value of some 10-11 million euros, we're talking about a large trade, probably an illegal trade of of babies of an acutely endangered animal. And what makes me so concerned about the eel recovery plan as it stands is that it allows for restocking without putting any conditions whatsoever on restocking. And the restocking measure is actually risks, I would say it's a huge risk, that it's a cover-up for eel fishing for illegal trade. €1 million business of selling baby eels for the Asian market for very large profits. And the restocking that is going where it should go, for instance, to the Baltic Sea or wherever, to try to contribute to the recovery of the European eel, that is also extremely uncertain. So ICES is saying, first of all, you don't know if the restocked eels find their way back to the Sargasso Sea to spawn, first of all, because they're translocated and they don't know if it takes them longer to swim back because they are consuming their fat and they may not reach the Sargasso Sea, which is 6,000 kilometers for them to swim. ICES is very uncertain about whether or not there's a surplus of eels to actually be translocated. diseases could also, parasites, diseases could also be translocated with restocking measures. So there's a number of question marks and let's say warning signals from ICES on the restocking measure as such. So all of this has led me to really focus a lot on the restocking and asking the Commission, so adding a new element actually, so asking the Commission to evaluate the trade on eels and also to evaluate, to look at the ICES advice on restocking and put that into their evaluation of the eel recovery plans. So basically, if we go through the report as such, what we've done is basically we tried not to touch the substance. The substance is, for instance, not evaluated. For the objective of the eel recovery plan is that 40% of all those eels, silver eels, that could, in a virgin state, could have escaped to the Sargasso Sea to spawn, they should be allowed to escape. That objective has never been evaluated by ICES. The objective as such may not be sufficient. Probably it is not sufficient. But that's the whole objective of the regulation. We have not touched that, so that's still there, and we try to not touch many things at all. But we've added recitals, which I think gives the framework for the seriousness of this issue. So Amendment 1 is adding the recital about that the eels are now included in Appendix 2 of the CITES Convention. Amendment 2 is adding that since 2010 the European eels are on the IUCN Red List as a critically endangered species. In Amendment 3 we added the latest scientific advice from ICES, which also recommends that the exploitation and other human activities affecting the stock should be reduced to as close to zero as possible. This is in the last version. It's not in this version that you have in front of you, so we will amend that later. We also added a recital explaining what ICES says in its 2012 advice about the glass eel stocking programs that are unlikely to contribute to the recovery of the European eel population in a substantial manner. And we added, because in Amendment 5, it's the original text about using glass eels for restocking, but we just added that it should be done provided that they are carried out under conditions that maximize the likelihood that the stocking will contribute to the recovery of the stock. Then we've done one substantial thing, and that is to delete an article which is very strange, that's been in the regulation all along, and that is the surveillance of the evaluation of market prices. So there is this provision that if there's a decline in the average market price for eels less than 12 centimeters used for restocking compared to prices of eels used for other measures, there should be a temporary reduction in the percentage of eels reserved for restocking. So basically in the regulation, by 2013, at least 60% of all glass eels that are caught should be used for restocking purposes. But this article says that if the difference in prices between the glass eels for restocking and the glass eels for other purposes is too big, then basically you could reduce the 60% target to something less. And this article has not been respected so far by the member states because they were supposed to submit all the data by 2011 to the Commission on the evaluation of market prices, and they did not. So the Commission changed in its Lisbonization proposal here now the year 2011 to 2013. So they already changed that, and I think it's become completely obsolete, this article, and completely counterproductive. We think that it should be taken away. It's far too late to do anything, and the Commission is, by any account, coming out with a new proposal on a new regulation. So this is not something that is important now. But what is important is to have the data on the trade. So we're proposing that instead. So on Amendment 10, we're deleting all that on the decline on average market prices, which also is connected to Amendment 11 and 12, where we also delete those because it's the same provision about the evaluation of market prices. Then there's an error, unfortunately, in Amendment 13. It says that Article 3 should be replaced by the following, but it should be Article 2. So it's a bit confusing there. And we've changed just for the record, it's not a big substance change. In Amendment 14, we added in one of the measures could be reducing and, if necessary, prohibiting commercial fishing activity. So we added the words and, if necessary, prohibiting. And that's not changing the substance because that's already what the member states can do and one member state have done. So Ireland has already prohibited commercial fishing and also recreational fishing. So it's just a clarification there. And Amendment 16 is also clarification that fishing may be permitted. It used to say shall be permitted. And Amendment 18 is also deleting the thing about monitoring the evaluation, the market prices. In Amendment 19, we think that the frequency of reporting of member states should not decrease after the first triennial report, but actually increase. Once the member states already have collected all the data, it's not very much more work for them to just check the data on an annual basis and submit it to the Commission. So they should do it, considering the urgency of the status of the eel stock, they should do it every year and not decrease the frequency. And finally, Amendment 20 is perhaps the most controversial amendment of it all, because what we're saying is that if ICES advice in 2013 confirms that the stock is in a critical state, all union fisheries for eels shall be suspended at least until the entry into force of a new legislation adopted on the basis of a proposal that the Commission should do by the latest in 2014. We know that this is already a process that's going on, that the Commission is waiting for an evaluation of the eel management plans, of the progress of the eel management plans from the member states. ICES is doing that in June or July, We think we already heard some indications that what the member states submitted so far is not enough, so it will take more time and so on. This whole process has been going on for such a long time. The whole eel problem started more than 10 years ago, where the Commission, more than 10 years ago, when the Commission started to try to get the member states on board on some kind of measure. It's been going on for a very, very long time. The member states have been very reluctant in implementing any measures or submitting any data, anything they should do. And ICES is just confirming and confirming and confirming the urgency of the stock. And considering what's happening with the restocking measures, and perhaps that's even worsening the situation, I think it's justified to actually have an emergency break here and wait to see how and when we can restart with fisheries and being sure that we're not exterminating this critically endangered species with our eyes open. So now I'm very keen to hear colleagues, your views on this, and looking forward to working with you, all the shadow rapporteurs.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Ms. Levine. Ms. Fraga, please. Well, I have a few problems with this report. Firstly, procedural. In comitology, except for a couple of exceptions that we've seen, the Commission called for one regarding changing market prices as set out in the regulation, modifiable. But apart from that, we shouldn't use a proposal for comitology adaptation to change the regulation, because that regulation that we worked through at the time, there were very tense debates, not only at the Parliament but at the Council, until the agreement was reached. So I don't go along with making any changes, as the rapporteur says. Now, some people may agree with that, but I don't. Now, there are some that I don't understand, such as 6. I don't think it adds anything. I think that's covered in Article 7 of the regulation. Those are a couple of general points. And then I don't agree with the fact that in the legal basis, with the delegated acts, we've got these executing acts as well, because the delegated acts fit fully under the scope of the regulation. And then from the Parliament's point of view, it's much better for us to have delegated acts, because we can always have greater control than implementing acts. So this seems to be an about turn from delegated acts to implementing measures. So that doesn't fit under the scope. And secondly, it takes away power from the Parliament and puts it elsewhere. So in terms of substance, I don't agree with some of the form. I do agree with some of them, but I really don't go along with using this as an opportunity, this comitology change, to use this to change the regulation. People are saying the substance doesn't change, but it does some places. And then secondly, I don't agree with us going from delegated acts to implementing measures, because that isn't anything that makes any sense. But thank you, Mr. Kuhn.
Ja, herzlichen Dank an die Berichterstatter.
Well, thank you very much to the rapporteur, and also to Mrs. Fraga for what she has said. And I think it's necessary for us really to talk about the principle here, how such a regulation, which is meant to be adapted to the Lisbon Treaty, then, when it comes to the technical parts of it, is going to be reworked. Now, when we talk about content, if we want to talk about content, then I think you should put that onto the agenda. Otherwise, we're mixing up different aspects, which we shouldn't really be doing. Now, in 2007, we did have this very difficult situation that European eel stocks became dangerously low, and the Parliament and the Council reacted to that, and then they discussed Regulation 1100 from 2007 and adopted it. And a very decisive point back then was that the catching an export of glass eels or eels in general, whether we're talking about younger juvenile eels or adults, was completely banned outside of the European Union, as was processing as well. So exports to glass eel to Southeast Asia was completely banned to allow eels to remain for the purposes of reproduction and stock recovery. And member states were forced to table plans of measures they were going to take so that stocks could be regenerated, taking account of all of the various aspects necessary for that to take place. Now, that was the starting position, and ICES and many other scientific committees really don't know whether stocks have recovered very well or not. They're still rather in the dark. They don't know whether the measures have really been successful. The first findings in the Bay of Biscay leave some room for optimism, in fact. That's the only area where you can really test as to whether how many eels are swimming from the Sargasso Sea back to the Bay of Biscay, the Baltic, and other maritime areas. That's the only way you can really measure whether there's been any positive progress. Now, when it comes to the regulation, delegated acts, and so on, well, I think we need to take a closer look at what we really want to do there. But I think, in principle, handing all of this just over to the scientists, whether we're talking about ICES or CITES, they're rather more responsible for trade in endangered species or putting them on the lists. I think that we in the Parliament, together with Council and Commission, shouldn't allow our own competences to run through our fingers and be taken away from us. It's useful and necessary, in fact, that the restocking plans for eel stocks should be allowed to work. Glass eels will, of course, need to be caught in the Baltic, the North Sea, and other areas as well. We need to make sure that barriers are made passable for them, and that in inland water, in lakes and so on, that we need to allow them to reproduce and so on. But we need to bear in mind their natural habitats are the Sargasso Sea, the Bermuda Triangle, and so on, and they need to be allowed to reproduce in those areas too. And we need to talk about such sensible alternatives as well. Now, if we say, well, yes, it's possible to do this, possible to do that, and do everything in the subjunctive or the conditional, then you're not really basing your report on scientific evidence. And if we say, well, let's just have a moratorium for 1 year and no more eel can be caught at all, whether they're glass eel or other types of eel which are marketable as well. Mrs. Levine wishes to perhaps touch upon the subject of market prices as well. And I think that a lot of these points are rather problematic. I take the view that we shouldn't just be interrupting the way that this regulation is working. It's proposed by the Commission, Council and everyone else. We should say, no, let's scrap all that and let's take different measures for which we don't really have a basis. Well, I don't think that's really what we should be doing. We want, of course, for eel stocks to recover step by step, but nevertheless we also want the eel to remain available for Europe's fishermen. And we too want the eel to carry on being part of our natural heritage. That is our objective, but we need balance. Thank you.
Gracias, señor Kuhn. Señor Nilsson.
Thank you very much. Chairman, I'll be very brief. I got this today in the Swedish language, this document, so I've read through it, and we had a discussion back in January where a number of important points came up, and I think that the rapporteur certainly has been listening to them. First of all, let me say that I'm going to, or my political group is going to recommend that we remember the fact that the eel is endangered of extinction. So I don't think we should just adapt the regulation to the new Lisbon Treaty. We should say that we want proper measures to be taken. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that. Now, as for how we word those demands, well, we'll have to debate that, because we do have different points of view about stopping fishing for a particular period. Is that a good idea or bad? There's some scientific knowledge about this, but there are a number of questions. Who's going to do what? The Commission or the Member States? There are certain management plans which are perhaps not working very well. How should they be followed up, and by whom? So we need to come back to a number of questions, and there's the question of delegated acts as well, and implementing acts, and what is best. But as I've said, we need to say that the eel is in danger of extinction, and that's unacceptable. We have to do something. I think we should say that very clearly when we discuss this opinion. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. We finished from MEPs. Let's give the floor to Mr. Benker from the Commission.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good afternoon to everybody. We would first of all like to congratulate Mrs. Lövin for putting this document on the table. We have said before, so I'm not going to dwell much on this point, that we are in the context of a Lisbonization process. So for us, we did put this proposal on the table the way it is, because we were in that context. Now, having said that, I think Mrs. Lövin raised a number of points, and we do acknowledge that there are significant concerns. We have to take account of those concerns regarding the state of the stock, which is problematic. And this is already reflected in annual reports from ICES. As the rapporteur has said, we are in the middle of a process now of assessing how the whole regulation has functioned, on top of looking at the most recent scientific advice from ICES and STECF that will become available by June, July, if the Member States communicate their information in good form and on time. And as foreseen in the regulation, we were planning to come forward with a report on all of this towards the end of the year. So this was the planning that we had taken. Now, there's many of the concerns that we've heard today will certainly feed into this reflection, into what we are doing. And of course, we would like to have, we would like to really be able to integrate into all of this the latest ICES and STECF reports, so that we have a good picture, a picture that is as good as possible. So we just to give you the background of this proposal being what it is, we've been modest. Because we were in a Lisbonization context, and we knew that we were going to be producing a report, as we have been required to do, on the regulation. So we do hope that whatever happens, whatever orientation Parliament decides to take on this, there will be, if not here, certainly an opportunity very soon to be able to reflect the concerns that Mr. Lövin presented that are certainly there. Thank you.
Señora Lövin.
Ms. Lövin.
Thank you very much. Thank you all colleagues for your comments. Yes, well, concerning the comitology and the Lisbonization process, I already commented on that. I mean, it wasn't very easily done by me to try to not just go by the comitology, by the Lisbonization process and business as usual, but going through the whole, let's say, the calendar that this regulation has gone through over the years made me so worried that things would not happen that I had to really make these proposals. The member states have submitted their plans too late, the evaluation of the plans too late. There's been no coherence in the data they submitted. And, I mean, I could foresee that the whole evaluation process will also take a very long time. The regulation as such took years to negotiate. Everything is dragging. And in the meantime, ICES advice is more and more strong for each year and saying that fisheries should be as close to zero as possible, and we're just ignoring this. And that's basically why I propose that if ICES is saying that for the 10th year in a row, well, let's stop fisheries. That's what I'm saying. So, Mrs. Fraga, on the delegated acts, I agree that delegated acts are to be preferred to implementing acts, but just to clarify, what we deleted in amendments 11 and 12 is that was the only proposal from the Commission on delegated acts, and that was that the Commission should use delegated acts to produce the price evaluation monitoring thing. And since I don't think that's something that is actually valid today, to see if there's a significant decline of average market prices for eels, and we decided to try to delete that. Then we also had to delete all references to delegated acts. And Mr. Kuhn, you said, Werner, that exports have been banned, and that's true. What's the problem is that if you look at the catch data, and let's say there's more glass eels being caught than being marketed. So the big question mark is, where does that fish disappear? Up into thin air, or where? Or it's exported illegally. That's the problem. So if everyone were abiding by the rules, there wouldn't be any problem, but that's the problem. And Mr. Nilsson, thank you so much for your support, and I think we could reach an agreement on doing something. And regarding Lisbonization or not Lisbonization, I didn't mention that before, but I mean, we had Mr. Wawense's report as well, was also Lisbonization, and we also went into the details and changed that. And I think there was a large consensus on that, so I don't think that should be a major problem. Thank you.
Bien, si no hay ninguna.
If no one else wants to raise anything, then the deadline for amendments is the 25th of February at midday. Regarding the previous point, we said a week, didn't say when. That's the 4th of March. That's to do with IUU fishing, the 4th of March. And the other one, the 25th of February. Anything else? Thank you. The session is lifted until tomorrow at 9. The Chair kindly thanks the interpreters and others.